Continuing on with the free trade agreement conversation, as a part of any FTA, countries negotiate how and when specific products will eventually have duty-free access to their respective markets. I think sometimes people believe, especially when you hear on the news that a free trade agreement is going into place, that countries immediately have duty-free access in a reciprocal fashion to their respective markets. That's not the case at all. That's why these free trade agreement negotiations take so long. The Trans-Pacific Partnership that's going on today in 2015 is a good example of that. So it takes a long time to negotiate the terms of a free trade agreement. And whereas, as we note in our second bullet point, that when a free trade agreement goes into place, about 80% of all products become duty-free. The rest of a type of product has to be negotiated over time. So as we note from our sub-bullet point in bullet number 2, the rest of these products, the remaining 20%, could be footwear, could be wearing apparel, certainly agricultural products. The rest of those products are reduced to zero duty over a period of years. And in the case of NAFTA, which, as I mentioned, is now 20 plus years old, it took that long for most all products to get down to a zero duty rate. Important to mention, last bullet point, and this is going to come up over and over again throughout all of our modules, is that this whole concept of country of origin, where are goods actually produced? Where did they come from? For purposes of an FTA, in order to qualify for duty-free status, the importer, a buyer of footwear in the United States, for example, from Vietnam, has to be able to prove that the product really was made in Vietnam, and there are very specific criteria for determining what are called country of origin rules. Again, we'll hear more and more about that as we move forward, but this whole idea within the world of supply chain management of country of origin, not just important for free trade agreements, but importing in general. So more on that later on. Some examples of free trade agreements around the world. First, it's important to say there are dozens of them, so this is not an exhaustive list. I mentioned NAFTA already, 20 years old, includes Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. Some others that don't involve the United States, just to give an example of what goes on outside the U.S., is called Mercosur, which is Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, with Bolivia, Chile, and Venezuela as associate members. So a trade bloc in South America, good example is Mercosur, where they can trade amongst each other in a reciprocal fashion on a duty-free basis. Another important, changing geographies, another important FTA is what's called ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is made up of Brunei Darussalam, Cambodia, Laos PDR, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. So just a couple of examples, some from the United States and others from other parts of the world. Free trade agreements have really driven global trade, but are becoming more and more prominent as time goes by. I mentioned already, and we'll mention again, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that is actually being negotiated between the United States and many of the nations you see here in our last bullet point. Not all of them, but some. We'll identify those in just a bit. So just some examples of free trade agreements around the world. A true driver historically of globalization and becoming more and more so in the year 2015 and beyond. Also found in the HTS US that we alluded to a moment ago are U.S. free trade agreements that are currently in place. This does not include the Trans-Pacific Partnership. As of the recording of this module, that free trade agreement has not been agreed upon yet, although more than likely imminent. So this is what we have in place today, and it is alphabetical. So Australia, Bahrain has a free trade agreement with the U.S. Of course, Canada we talked about. Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. Those Central American countries are all part of what's called CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, which does involve the Dominican Republic as well. So they can all be bunched in together as CAFTA. Our first free trade agreement, upper right-hand side, was with Israel in 1984. That's still in place. We also have FTAs with Jordan, Korea, Mexico as part of NAFTA, Morocco, Nicaragua as part of CAFTA, Oman, Panama, Peru, and Singapore. So these are the countries that the U.S. has FTAs in place with right now. Let's talk for a moment about that Trans-Pacific Partnership. As I said a moment ago, as of the recording of this module, the TPP has not been agreed upon. Most people think it's imminent, perhaps by the end of 2015, maybe not, but very high probability that the TPP will take place. You'll note from our lower right-hand side, as time goes by, the source for this information is the Office of the USTR. That's the United States Trade Representative. That's another government entity that you need to know who it is and what they do as your journey towards supply chain excellence continues. So all information about free trade agreements, how they work, who they're with, what are the details, can all be found on the USTR webpage. That's the United States Trade Representative. And that's the government entity that kind of represents the President and Congress as free trade agreements are being negotiated. So the TPP, let's have a look at our bullet points here. It's a trade agreement, or what's been referred to as a 21st century trade agreement, currently being negotiated between 12 countries, some of which you'll recognize already having free trade agreements with the U.S. They are Australia, Brunei Darussalam, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, of course the U.S., and Vietnam. To give you an example of how long these negotiations take place, something I had mentioned a moment ago, a good example is TPP. The U.S. got involved in this in 2009. It's now halfway through 2015. Why so long? Because so many countries have so many different commercial interests across different industries that all of these negotiations, almost line by line, product by product, have to take place. That's why it takes so long. One thing about what's referred to as a 21st century free trade agreement that's different from what you'd see from the U.S.-Israel free trade agreement back in 1984 is that it's much more comprehensive. It doesn't just cover the reduction or removal of tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade. It also includes sections on intellectual property, use of the internet, human rights, human trafficking, labor regulations, etc. So it's a broader type of agreement that also includes elements of environmental protection as well. So much more comprehensive and evolved than the earlier free trade agreements.